A recent poll conducted in Canada revealed that 74% of Canadians feel that we've done a better job managing things here in Canada than in the United States. Now, you are in the US, so what do you think?
Well, Lainey, I can only speak for myself, but I have to say, like where we are, things have been. It's been very good. All my neighbours, my neighbourhood, everybody seems to be self-quarantined. Wherever we go, people are wearing masks and tend to be taking this very seriously. So for us, I think we've done a fairly good job here. I'm unable to speak for the rest of America or the rest of Tennessee for that matter, but I feel like in my circle, we've been trying our very best to follow the rules and stay safe.
It's interesting that you're in the States, because I think it's easy for us to feel maybe a little smug when we see footage coming out of some US cities, like Michigan, where we saw hundreds of, conservative activists protesting extended stay-at-home orders, orders that are there to keep them alive. And I think a lot of us shake our head and we think, oh, I'm so glad we're in Canada. But then we have our own yahoos, as Doug Ford has called them as well. And besides carrying rifles, they're not that dissimilar. But for the most part, I think I at least have like a great sense of pride and gratitude. I know in Italy, they're in their 7th week of lockdown, I believe, and the government had promised freelance workers €600 checks. But a lot of them still haven't received that money because of Italian bureaucracy. Probably a lot of you, I'm sure, can imagine that. But here in Toronto, I think we've all heard these stories where people applied for relief, and then 2 or 3 days later, they're getting a check and they're able to pay their rent, they're able to eat. So there's a great deal of pride, I guess, in the way our country, maybe not across the board, but in general, how we're doing things, and sort of proceeding with a great deal of caution, if you will.
Yeah, we can understand why Canadians feel the way they do. I'm proud of our leadership at a time when we were starting to physically distance in Canada. The President of the United States was still calling this a disease a virus rather, that we didn't really have to worry about. He was calling it, the Chinese virus, politicizing it. And over here, we were seeing, a prime minister doing a daily press conference, weekends included, taking questions from reporters. And we were seeing the same as premiers. And the other thing that has blossomed that has been really nice to see is that people have come together that you wouldn't expect to come together. You've got, an Ontario premier, a conservative premier, who now says that Chrystia Freeland, the deputy prime minister, a liberal, is one of the people he leans on the most. He says they have conversations, every day, because they both understand the situation and are learning from each other. So this is actually bringing people together in an interesting way. And I find that amazing.
I agree with you, Marcy, in terms of the leadership, and specifically how the leadership, as it should, is supporting frontline workers. I mean, of course, there's no such thing as perfection, but when we think about who is being hit the hardest, at the top of the list for sure are the frontline workers, the healthcare workers, people in essential services. And I say this because I know somebody in Vancouver who works at one of Vancouver's major hospitals. Prior to the lockdown, she was told, along with all the other staff, that they needed to get the wards ready, they needed to prepare beds, they needed to make sure that the hospital was ready for what they were anticipating to be an influx and a surge of COVID-19 patients. At British Columbia's peak, and they're saying that they have been flattening the curve, at British Columbia's peak, according to my friend who works at that hospital, they were, and I say only very, sensitively here, they were only at 60% capacity. And that is wonderful news, because it means that those healthcare workers, at least in that hospital, weren't being stressed to the max. And that's been one of the concerns. That's actually one of the reasons why we're physically distancing, because we do not want to overwhelm the healthcare system. So when I hear stories like that, and I know other healthcare workers in other environments may have other stories, but when I hear stories like that about our healthcare workers and their experiences, I feel very encouraged about how this has been managed in Canada.
You know what? I think the biggest difference that I've noticed is that our leadership has empathy. There have been around the world tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives lost. And if you just take a look at the leaders of our country and of the United States, there just doesn't seem to be a whole lot of, this is really terrible. I am so sorry for the families who have lost family members. We're going to do our best to take care of you and to continue to keep other people safe. I mean, I just haven't heard any compassion. I've heard a lot of, we've got this under control from the American president, which clearly you don't if you have one of the world's highest death rates. But what I'm so proud of is leadership in Canada across the board, be it from our prime minister and certainly from the premiers, of just understanding and compassion that there is terrible human suffering happening, whether it's someone who's lost a loved one or someone who is having a terrible time in a long-term care facility and is isolated. I feel like that has been such a fundamental difference in how we approach this. And perhaps more importantly, even than that, is our country following the science, it seems, much better than the Americans. And you only have to look at the president who pushes untested medicines for a very terrible disease. And all I have to say is, like, disinfectant anyone? I mean, we're not there. And I feel like if there's a trickle down effect, if you've got someone at the top who's behaving poorly, what does the bottom look like?
It's really interesting, guys.
Point about science.
It's really interesting. I live primarily, most of my time is spent in America, but needless to say, I have family and I spend a lot of time in Canada. I think one of the biggest problems with the world really is that we have this huge paintbrush that we tend to paint and generalize, and I would hate for anybody to generalize me based on anything really, but I look at America and I just cannot tell you how many times or how many conversations I've had with people that America this and America that and America this and America that, and it's purely based on obviously the man in charge and some of the words that he says. It makes a lot of people feel very uncomfortable, but I have to say that the majority of Americans that I speak to, they feel the same as you. I think that people are going to be people, and I think most people sort of live in the middle of the road and use common sense. Unfortunately, some of the information that is put out there and the ways that it's put out there, it makes a bit of a mockery of the situation as a whole. But I think that most Americans, there's 40 million of them. I believe the majority of Americans are taking this very seriously and understand the issues at hand.